drink it, sweetheart, or army girls too soft for vodka." A voice behind her cut through the bar noise like a bladey. Major Daria Hollis stood in the dim corner of the All Ranks Club at Fort Liberty, her off-duty civilian clothes, jeans and a plain grey T-shirt, drawing sneers from 3 Navy SEALs who decided she was easy prey. They saw a woman alone at a bar, small-framed, quiet. Someone to humiliate for sport on a Friday night. What they didn't see was the tan beret and Special Forces tab folded inside her jacket pocket, or the Ranger's scroll she'd earned at Fort Moore. And they certainly didn't know that in 72 hours, she'd be briefing their entire SEAL platoon on a joint task force operation in Yemen, where she'd be their ground force commander. The loudest one, a senior chief petty officer with too much bourbon in his system, grabbed her drink and poured it down the front of her shirt, laughing like he'd just won a bet. He had no idea he'd just assaulted the officer who held his career in her hands. Fort Liberty, North Carolina, sat under a heavy August sky, the kind of oppressive heat that made even seasoned soldiers question their life choices. The All Ranks Club was packed with Friday night energy, laughter, clinking glasses, the low hum of off-duty personnel trying to forget the weight of their jobs for a few hours. The air smelled like spilled beer, fried food, and cologne applied too liberally. Major Daria Hollis, 29 years old, sat at the far end of the bar nursing a single vodka tonic she'd been holding for an hour. She was 5'5", athletically built in a way that spoke of functional strength rather than gym vanity, with dark hair pulled into a low ponytail and hazel eyes that missed nothing. She wore civilian clothes deliberately. Faded jeans, a grey T-shirt, scuffed boots. Because she'd learned long ago that blending in was easier than dealing with the questions that came with rank. She'd come here to decompress after 6 weeks of mission planning, but the moment she walked in, she'd felt the eyes on her, not the respectful kind, the predatory kind. 3 Navy SEALs occupied the corner booth near the dartboard, a senior chief petty officer and 2 petty officers first class, all from a SEAL Team 8 platoon, all freshly rotated back from a deployment to the Horn of Africa. They were loud, confident, and looking for trouble in the way that some operators did when they thought their reputations made them untouchable. The senior chief, a man named Garrett Roque with a thick neck and a louder voice, had been watching Daria for 20 minutes. He'd made comments to his teammates. Comments she could hear clearly from across the room, about how the army must be lowering standards if they were letting women hang out in places meant for real warriors. His buddies laughed. Daria kept her eyes on her drink. She wasn't here to prove anything. She'd spent the last 7 years doing that in places these men had only read about in classified briefs. She'd earned her Ranger tab at Fort Moore, survived Special Forces assessment and selection, and spent 3 years running reconnaissance operations in Syria, Iraq, and East Africa as part of a joint task force that operated in the shadows. Her service record was compartmentalized. Her awards were classified, and in 3 days, she'd be standing in front of a room full of CLs and Green Berets, briefing them on Operation Tidebreak, a direct action raid targeting a high-value Iranian weapons smuggler operating out of Yemen. But right now in this bar, she was just another woman these men thought they could disrespect without consequence. Garrett Roque stood up and walked toward her, his grin sharp and ugly. Daria Hollis grew up in a military family that bled green. Her father, Colonel James Hollis, had been a Green Beret who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam and come home with a chest full of medals and a philosophy he drilled into his daughter from the time she could walk. Respect is earned, never given, and silence is a weapon sharper than any blade. He never coddled her. When she was 12 and came home crying because boys at school said girls couldn't be soldiers, he handed her a rucksack, told her to fill it with rocks, and made her hike 5 miles through the woods behind their house in North Carolina. When she finished, he told her the only person who could decide her limits was her. Everyone else was just noise. When Daria enlisted at 22 with a degree in international relations, her father didn't celebrate. He just nodded once and told her the same thing he'd told her brothers: don't embarrass the name. She didn't. She exceeded every standard, passed Ranger School on her first attempt, and volunteered for Special Forces assessment and selection despite being told, repeatedly, that women didn't belong in that pipeline. Her father died 2 months before she graduated the Q course. Massive heart attack, no warning. She'd been in the field during a training exercise and didn't get the news until 3 days later. She missed his funeral. By the time she made it home, all that was left was a folded flag and a handwritten note he'd left in his desk drawer addressed to her. The note said, "You'll face men who think your presence is a threat to their identity. They'll test you. Some will try to break you. Don't waste energy hating them. Just be so good they can't ignore you. Make them earn the right to stand next to you. That's how you honor the uniform. That's how you honor me." She carried that note in her kit on every deployment. It had been with her in Mosul when her team took fire during a reconnaissance mission that went sideways. It had been with her in Somalia when she spent 72 hours behind enemy lines calling in airstrikes that saved a Ranger platoon from being overrun. It had been with her in Syria when she led a joint team of Green Berets and SEALs in a raid that captured an ISIS financier whose intel led to the collapse of an entire terror cell. Her call sign was Viper, given to her by her team after she'd remained motionless in a sniper hide for 14 hours in 110-degree heat, then made a single shot that ended a hostage situation in Baghdad. She'd earned the respect of every operator she'd worked with, every single one, until tonight, because the 3 SEALs across the bar didn't know who she was. They hadn't read her file. They hadn't been briefed yet. All they saw was a woman alone, and in their arrogance, they'd decided she was an easy target. Daria took a slow sip of her drink and watched Garrett Rook approach in the mirror behind the bar. She could have left. She could have identified herself, but her father's voice echoed in her head, "Don't waste energy hating them. Just be so good they can't ignore you." So she stayed, and she waited. Garrett Rook stopped directly behind Daria, close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath. He leaned in and asked if she was lost, because the army barracks were on the other side of base. His tone was mocking, designed to provoke his 2 teammates. Petty Officer First Class Danny Cho and Petty Officer First Class Marcus Hayes laughed from the booth. Daria set her glass down carefully and turned to face him. Her voice was calm, almost friendly, as she told him she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Rook's grin widened. He told her that real operators came here on Friday nights, and if she wanted to stay, she'd have to prove she belonged. Cho walked over holding a shot glass filled with vodka. He set it on the bar in front of Daria and told her if she could drink it without flinching, they'd leave her alone. If she couldn't, she'd have to admit the army sent soft people to do hard jobs. Daria looked at the shot glass, then at Cho, then at Rook. She told them she didn't have anything to prove to them. Rook's expression darkened. He told her that everyone had something to prove, especially women who showed up in places they didn't belong. Then he grabbed the shot glass and poured it down the front of her shirt. The bar went silent. Heads turned. A few army officers at nearby tables stood up, but Daria raised one hand, a subtle gesture that told them to stand down. She didn't break eye contact with Rook. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, vodka soaking into her shirt, her face carved from stone. Rook leaned in close, his voice low and venomous, and told her she should run back to whatever desk job the army gave her and stop pretending she was something she wasn't. Daria smiled. It was a cold, controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes. She told him she'd see him Monday morning. Rook laughed and asked what the hell that meant. She didn't answer. She just turned, picked up her jacket from the bar stool, and walked out of the bar without looking back. Behind her, Rook and his teammates celebrated like they'd won something. Outside, the night air was thick and humid. Daria walked to her truck, climbed in and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Her shirt was still wet. Her chest was tight with controlled rage, not at the humiliation, but at the waste of it all. These were supposed to be elite operators, men trained to work alongside the best soldiers in the world, and they'd just spent their Friday night bullying a stranger in a bar because it made them feel powerful. She thought about her father's note. She thought about every mission she'd run, every firefight she'd survived, every decision she'd made that kept people alive. And she thought about Monday morning, when Garrett Rook and his platoon would walk into the briefing room at the Tactical Operations Center and see her standing at the front of the room wearing her major's rank and the USSOC combat patch on her shoulder. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to the JSA Key Liaison Officer. Confirm SEAL Team 8 attendance at Monday's tidebreak brief. Full platoon roster required. The reply came back in 30 seconds confirmed. Full platoon 0800 sharp. Daria started the truck and drove home. She didn't drink the rest of the weekend. She didn't vent. She just prepared. Because when Monday came, she wasn't going to embarrass Garrett Rook. She was going to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. Daria spent Saturday morning at the gym, running through a brutal circuit of kettlebell swings, pull-ups and hill sprints until her lungs burned and her legs shook. She wasn't training for anything specific. She was burning off the residual anger that had settled in her chest like a stone. The physical pain was easier to process than the emotional kind. That night, she sat alone in her small base apartment, a Spartan space with military, issued furniture and exactly 3 personal items: a framed photo of her father in his green beret uniform, the folded flag from his funeral, and the handwritten note he'd left her, now laminated and kept in a wooden box on her desk. She opened the box and read the note for the 100th time. Don't waste energy hating them. Just be so good they can't ignore you. Her father had faced his own version of Garrett Rook a dozen times over his career. Men who thought lineage mattered more than performance. Men who resented his success because it made their mediocrity obvious. He'd never retaliated with anger. He'd retaliated with excellence. And that's what had made him legendary. Daria traced her finger along the edge of the note and thought about Friday night. She wasn't angry because Rook had poured a drink on her. She'd dealt with worse in combat zones where the stakes were life and death. She was angry because he'd done it in front of other soldiers, in a place that was supposed to be neutral ground, and he'd done it believing there would be no consequences. He was wrong. She thought about the briefing on Monday, Operation Tidebreak, a joint direct action raid targeting Arman Rizai, an Iranian Quds force operative running weapons through Yemen to Houthi militants. The mission was complex, high risk, and politically sensitive. It required surgical precision, flawless coordination between Army Special Forces and Navy SEALs, and a ground commander who could manage egos and keep everyone focused on the objective. That commander was her. She'd spent 6 weeks building the operational plan, coordinating with intelligence assets, and securing approval from CENTCOM. The SEALs didn't know it yet, but their success depended entirely on her leadership. Garrett Rook would walk into that briefing room expecting another routine mission. Instead, he'd find the woman he'd humiliated standing at the front of the room with the authority to recommend his removal from the operation. Daria closed the box and set it back on her desk. She wasn't going to humiliate him. She wasn't going to gloat. She was just going to do her job with such precision and competence that he'd spend the rest of his career wondering how he'd been so blind. She went to bed early. Monday couldn't come fast enough. Monday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that made the walk from the parking lot to the Tactical Operations Center feel like a movement through hostile terrain. Daria arrived at ZO 730 minutes before the brief, wearing her Army OCP uniform with her major's rank clearly visible and the tan Special Forces beret folded neatly in her cargo pocket. She carried a leather portfolio containing the mission brief, satellite imagery, and a personnel roster that included every name in the room. The briefing room was sterile and functional, white walls, a large digital screen at the front, rows of chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the podium. A long table at the back held coffee, energy drinks, and individually secured mission folders marked TXQCIC. Daria set her materials on the podium and waited. At 07:55, the door opened and the operators started filing in. First came the Army Special Forces team, 6 Green Berets from 3rd Special Forces Group, led by Master Sergeant Luis Cordero, a veteran with 4 deployments and a reputation for being unshakable under fire. He nodded at Daria as he entered. They'd worked together before. He knew exactly who she was. Then came the SEALs. The SEAL Team 8 platoon entered as a unit. 14 operators, all wearing their Navy Type 3 working uniforms, most carrying coffee or energy drinks. Garrett Rook walked in near the front, flanked by Petty Officers Cho and Hayes. They were laughing about something, relaxed and confident. Rook looked up, saw Daria standing at the podium and froze. His face went through a sequence of expressions in 3 seconds: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally dread. Cho saw her next. He went pale. Hayes just stared. Daria didn't react. She stood at ease, hands behind her back, and waited for everyone to take their seats. The room filled quickly. The JSO's liaison officer, an Army Lieutenant Colonel named Thomas Brennan, entered last and took a seat in the front row. He glanced at Daria and gave a slight nod. The brief was hers. At exactly 0800, Daria stepped to the podium and addressed the room. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried the kind of authority that came from experience, not volume. She introduced herself as Major Daria Hollis, Ground Force Commander for Operation Tidebreak, and told them they had 72 hours to prepare for a direct action raid in Yemen targeting a high-value individual responsible for funneling advanced anti-aircraft systems to Houthi militants. She walked them through the intelligence. Satellite imagery showing Rizai's compound in the mountains outside Sana'a, signals intercepts confirming his presence, and pattern of life analysis indicating a narrow operational window. She outlined the mission phases: insertion via MH-47 Chinook, overland movement to the target, compound breach and clearance, capture or kill of the HV, and extraction under potential hostile fire. Then she addressed roles. The Green Berets would form the primary assault element. The SEALs would establish outer cordon security and provide rapid response capability if enemy reinforcements appeared. Daria would command from the Tactical Operations Center with direct communication to air support, ISR assets, and higher command. She paused and made eye contact with Garrett Rook. Her voice didn't change, but the weight of her words landed like a hammer. She told the room that this mission required absolute trust, flawless coordination, and zero tolerance for unprofessional behavior. She told them that egos had no place in a combat zone, and anyone who couldn't follow orders or work as part of a team would be removed from the operation immediately. Rook's jaw tightened. He didn't look away, but his face was flushed. Daria continued. She spent the next 45 minutes walking through contingencies, rules of engagement, casualty evacuation procedures, and communication protocols. She answered every question with precision. She knew the terrain, the weather patterns, the enemy's capabilities, and the political ramifications of failure. She was so thoroughly prepared that even the most skeptical operators in the room couldn't find a gap in her plan. When the brief ended, Lieutenant Colonel Brennan stood and told the room that Major Hollis had his full confidence and that any issues with chain of command should be brought directly to him. Then he dismissed everyone except the element leaders. As the room cleared, Garrett Rook walked past Daria without making eye contact. But she saw his hands. They were shaking. The element leaders remained in the briefing room. Master Sergeant Cordero from the Green Berets and Lieutenant Jason Merrick, the SEAL platoon commander who hadn't been at the bar Friday night. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan stood at the front with Daria, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Brennan addressed the group. He told them that Major Hollis had flagged a personnel concern that needed to be resolved before mission execution. He looked directly at Merrick and asked if there were any issues within his platoon that might affect mission performance. Merrick's eyes narrowed. He was a 34-year-old SEAL officer with 12 years in, a man who'd earned his trident the hard way and expected his men to uphold the same standards. He asked what kind of concern. Brennan didn't answer. He looked at Daria and told her to explain. Daria kept her voice level and professional. She told them that on Friday night, 3 members of the SEAL platoon, Senior Chief Rook, Petty Officer Cho, and Petty Officer Hayes, had engaged in conduct unbecoming of military personnel at the All Ranks Club. She described the incident factually: the verbal harassment, the poured drink, the physical intimidation. She didn't editorialize, she didn't express anger. She just stated what happened. The room went silent. Merrick's face hardened. Cordero, who'd been leaning against the wall, stood up straight. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan's expression shifted from neutral to ice-cold fury. Merrick asked if there were witnesses. Daria told him there were at least a dozen, including 2 Army captains and a Marine major who'd filed formal statements with the Provost Marshal's office over the weekend. Brennan pulled a tablet from his briefcase and slid it across the table to Merrick. On the screen was a time-stamped incident report from the club manager corroborating Daria's account. Merrick read it, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. He looked up at Daria and asked why she hadn't identified herself. Daria met his eyes and told him she shouldn't have to. Her rank, her service, and her authority weren't contingent on whether someone recognized her face. The behavior was unacceptable regardless of who she was. Cordero spoke up. He told Merrick that if any of his Green Berets had pulled something like that, they'd be off the mission and facing an Article 15 before the sun came up. He asked Merrick what the SEALs were going to do about it. Merrick's face was a mask of barely controlled rage, not at Daria but at his own men. He told Brennan that Rook, Cho, and Hayes would be removed from the mission immediately and face non-judicial punishment under the UCMJ. He also said he'd personally ensure they understood exactly who they disrespected and why their actions reflected on the entire platoon. Brennan nodded. He told Merrick to have replacements identified within 12 hours and to brief them immediately. He also made it clear that this incident would be documented in all 3 men's service records and forwarded to their commanding officer at Naval Special Warfare Group, TWO, for additional administrative action. Merrick stood at attention and acknowledged the order. Then he turned to Daria. His voice was tight but respectful. He told her his men had dishonored themselves and the teams, and that he would ensure nothing like this ever happened again under his command. He also told her that the rest of his platoon would execute her mission plan flawlessly, and that she'd have his full support as ground commander. Daria nodded once. That was all she needed. Brennan dismissed the element leaders. As they filed out, Merrick stopped in the doorway and looked back at Daria. He told her that if she led them into hell and brought them back, his platoon would never question her authority again. Daria met his eyes and told him that was the plan. Operation Tidebreak launched 72 hours later under a moonless sky. The insertion went flawlessly. 2 MH-47s carrying the assault force and support elements landed in a wadi 3 kilometers from the target compound. Daria commanded from the Tactical Operations Center at the forward operating base, linked by encrypted satellite communications to every element on the ground and every air asset overhead. The Green Berets executed the primary assault with surgical precision. The SEAL platoon held the outer cordon and provided immediate response when enemy scouts attempted to approach from the east. When Daria received intel from an overhead Reaper drone that a vehicle convoy was moving toward the compound, she coordinated an S-130 gunship strike that neutralized the threat 2 kilometers out. Armin Rezai was captured alive, 0 friendly casualties. The mission was a textbook success. During the after-action review back at base, Lieutenant Colonel Bren commended the entire task force. Then he singled out Daria, noting that her operational planning and real-time command had been the difference between success and disaster. Lieutenant Merrick stood and told the room that Major Hollis had earned the respect of every SEAL in his platoon. 3 days later, Daria was walking across the base when she saw Garrett Rook standing near the motor pool. He wasn't in uniform, he'd been temporarily reassigned to administrative duties pending his Article 15 hearing. When he saw her, he came to attention. He told her he'd been out of line at the bar and that he had no excuse. He told her he'd spent the weekend reading the after-action reports from the mission his replacements had run, and that he understood now what he'd cost himself. He asked if there was any way to earn back what he'd lost. Daria looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him respect wasn't something you asked for. It was something you demonstrated every day through your actions. She told him to be better. Then she walked away. 3 weeks later, Daria received orders for a new assignment, deputy commander for a joint counterterrorism task force operating across East Africa. Her father's note went with her, carefully packed in her kit. She was done proving herself. Now she was leading the people who mattered, and that was enough.